Hello and welcome. Welcome, Pat. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah. So welcome to the Peak State Fit Experience podcast, recorded from Peak State Fit in Salt Lake City, Utah. You are listening to our 7th episode. The first season of our podcast will follow the modules of Nail Your First IRONMAN, which is a course I created covering about 34 lessons, 6 hours of video lessons about covering your first Ironman, doing your first Ironman, taking on the challenge of even deciding to do the race, which race is right for you, what your goals should be. And so I help guide you through, and then all the way to the 4 pillars of Ironman Triathlon, which are swim, bike, run, and nutrition and recovery. So in our first 6 episodes of the podcast, we covered those topics, and our last episode 6 was the first of the 4 pillars, where we covered swimming with Tower 26 founder Jerry Rodriguez. It's a great episode. Check it out along with the others on YouTube or Spotify. And please hit that follow button. And maybe while you're there, give us a 5-star rating. We would really appreciate it. So Peak State Fit has placed an importance on education since our inception. Our business mission is to share knowledge and empower others through education. And we're excited to do that today with my guest, returning guest, my husband, Pat Casey, who is here today to discuss bike, everything getting you ready for the bike portion of training and racing your Ironman, particularly if you're a beginner looking to do your first Ironman, because that is sort of our focus right now. So our topic today is bike fitness, and strategies for Ironman training. I want to introduce Pat officially because when we had him on the first show, I let Pat introduce himself and he did a great job. And today I wanted to more formally introduce him by reading the bio that we have on our Peak State Fit website so that the listeners out there that may not know you can get to know you a little better. So here we go. And take a little sip of water. It's a long one. Okay. Pat Casey is a USA Triathlon Level 2 coach, a certified strength and conditioning specialist, Team USA age group coach, and Retool Premium certified bike fit expert. And I should mention one of only about 200 in the world with Retool Premium. His background as an elite road cyclist developed into a consulting and coaching career, which allowed him to combine his love of cycling and triathlon with his devotion to helping people improve their quality of life and realize their athletic potential through endurance sports. Pat grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where he spent the months he wasn't playing ice hockey riding his mountain bike. He was introduced to cross-country racing and joined the St. Louis-based cycling team Dogfish Racing when he was 15. At this time, Pat also got his first job as an aspiring bike mechanic, and he still wears that hat today, occasionally at Peak State Fit. So with 13 years of mechanic experience working in shops all over the Midwest, the Southeast, and the Mountain West. During Pat's undergraduate studies at Truman State University, Pat focused on health science, global health, and biology. He pursued work in the summer months that allowed him to further his experience and understanding of the human body. For 3 summers, Pat worked alongside Andy Coggan, co-author of Racing and Training with a Power Meter, at Mallinckrodt, did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
Mallinckrodt
Yeah.
Institute?
Mm-hmm.
Of Radiology at Washington University School of Medicine. Immersed in cycling as his means to escape and unplug, Pat found his love for cycling, physiology, and science all in one place. Upon graduation, Pat pursued an internship in Alabama and continued riding his road bike for transportation and recreation. During the summer of 2012, Pat rode his bike from San Francisco to Boston, Massachusetts in support of Partners for Health. This global health organization inspired mainly his move to Alabama after graduation. Getting back to racing in Alabama, Pat found himself on the podium and moved up the categories quickly with help from his coach, Heather. Instead of continuing on his path towards graduate school, Pat wanted to see where his dream of professional bike racing would take him. In 2014, Pat and Heather loaded up all their stuff and moved to Park City, Utah, and Pat joined Canyon Bicycle Shimano Domestic Elite Cycling Team. He spent the following spring and summer months from 2015 to 2016 traveling the U.S. on the Domestic Professional Road Tour, which is PRT for short, circuit, followed by a year with the New Orleans-based team Palmer Cycling. The latter would help him with a myriad of events and a role as a director and rider for this small squad. And in this role, Pat found himself more valuable as a team leader and coach rather than as a rider. In 2018, racing became an outlet for competition, but Pat's passion for coaching and devotion to his athletes outdistanced his desire to spend as much time on the road. He currently races as a Cat 1 at the national level with his team, Empire Cycling. In November of 2017, Pat was accepted to receive his USA Triathlon Level 2 certification at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. Pat was hired as the head coach with USA Triathlon Team USA and was selected to coach the duathlon and cross triathlon age group teams competing at the World Championships festivals in Fun, Denmark. He also served as head coach for all multi-sport teams at the World Championship festivals in Pontevedra, Spain in 2019 and in 2021 in Aviv, Spain. And then just this past November 2022 in Abu Dhabi. So quite an impressive resume and definitely can speak to the knowledge of all things for the bike.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So I want to start today with discussing that, the cycling portion of an Ironman is 80% of the race. That is the majority of the time that you're out there on race day. And for most, it's 112 miles as a reminder for people that may not be familiar with Ironman. And we want to prepare for that both through comfort and our physiology. So talk to us a little bit about how we can develop a better aerobic base, maybe even keeping enjoyment in mind that it doesn't always have to be time on the bike.
Yeah, I think that's it's a good topic to start with in terms of, I think, everyone getting into doing the race. It's an overwhelming feat to think about putting all these things together and how do you do them consecutively, especially speaking to beginners and people who maybe have some triathlon experience or none at all. And that's, I think the importance of the bike is so huge because, like you're right, you said it, the majority of the time that you're spending is going to be on the bike. You're splitting that swim with a marathon, and this bulk of time is not only, you have to get through it, but you have to also run off the bike. You have to be able to fuel effectively and maintain action potential in your muscles, keep your body functioning. And I think, starting out, giving yourself this sort of opportunity to enjoy the bike is crucial. Because if it's something that you dread, it's your least favorite part, you don't want to do it, you're going to be in a bad situation because the necessity of time that you need to spend is going to far outdistance the amount of time you can spend running to gain aerobic and mitochondrial density to be able to physiologically do the race, do the event on that day. And you can't make that up. You can't fake a 112 mile bike ride and then run a marathon or walk a marathon. So I think that's an important key. And in the last time I visited the podcast, we talked about the decision of what type of bike is right for you, your body, your biomechanics, and if you're going to pick one bike, what's that bike? What bike is going to be the best for you? Ultimately, I think a road bike is probably going to be the best if you're just going to pick one. A triathlon bike has the ability to be more efficient and help you run off the bike a little easier. However, if you're going to have one bike to do it all, a road bike is probably going to make make the experience a little bit more well-rounded, where you can ride with groups. It'll open more avenues for you to adventure on that bike. Your shifters and your brakes are all in the same place. You're not having to change positions. You could ride bike paths and kind of, get your feet on the ground with this sort of feeling of, consistency with riding. I will say the number one most important part of buying that bike is going to be your fit, and it's going to be really figuring out which size bike and which brands you're looking for that's going to be right for you. Some brands, I just did a pre-fit last night here in the studio, and this rider's parameters were, she was a 51 in some frames, and then she was a 49 in some frames, and then one frame she was a 54. And so just depending on how the geometry of the bike manufacturer is designed, it's not a one size fits all. You're not just like a 52 across the board. So understanding some of what goes into that before you go and spend that money and, jump off into this endeavor, it's important that you get the right size bike that's going to make your experience confidence inspiring, comfortable, fun. And then of course, making it that, it's an investment, and you're investing in not only that physical entity of the bike, but your progression into the sport.
Yeah. Buying the right size bike is so important, and we'll get into some other comfort aspects later in today's show. But being in love with the bike is so important, and being comfortable on the bike is probably, like you said, the most important first step in that process of being in love with that bike is being on the right size.
Yeah, totally.
I have been on the wrong size bike before, and it was very uncomfortable. It didn't last very long. Let's get back a little bit to, I want to use you as an example, because you are still racing at an elite level in cycling. And even though cycling is your primary sport, you do some other things to, develop your aerobic capacity, especially this time of year. So talk to us a little bit about some of the benefit of variety, but it's all can still go in the same direction of benefiting the aerobic capacity we need to go ride 112 miles.
Totally. Yeah. That's something I have adopted since we moved to Utah, that we have an opportunity to pursue other sports in the winter months. And I think for me, it's more mental than anything. But one thing we do a lot of in running, cycling, even swimming kind of is, it's more fluid. You're working in a different medium. And so your body is able to move through different planes of motion. But predominantly our movement patterns within cycling and running are in the sagittal plane, where we're, moving in this kind of front to back direction, up and down, where there is some spiraling supporting elements to those sports. So don't think that it's, we're not biplanar beings, but at the same time, we are heavily trained in this sagittal plane of movement. We don't work a lot in the transverse plane or the frontal plane. And I think that's one of those benefits that haphazardly I've recognized the benefits to, is seeing how much working through those different planes of motion in skate skiing for me has just diversified the training for me to gain strength, as well as improve my aerobic fitness without just sitting on my trainer for hours on end. And that to me is where the mental piece comes in. It makes the training, the goals of base training, a lot less daunting to think I have to sit on my trainer for 6 to 8 hours a week. Some people do that. Some people love it. They do absolutely just fine with it. But I tend to benefit more personally from working in those different, and I think a lot of people that are getting into the sport that maybe have a background in alpine skiing or ski touring, or, maybe you play club soccer or basketball. I think those things are important to maintain, because you're not only going to gain fitness through those sports, but you'll have fun doing them. And that's keeping it fun is probably the part that a lot of people don't do enough of is, and a lot of triathletes, I think, tend to have personality types that are very driven. Maybe people that are a little more type A. And so they have this very linear idea that, I have to just run and swim and bike and I have to follow this plan. But not everybody needs that. Not everybody needs that directed focus structure, because I think the burnout can be really high. And that's the last thing we want to get 3 months into the training and your race is still 5 months away. And you're like, I'm so burned out on staring at this virtual universe and riding Zwift and doing the same intervals. And so don't be afraid to change it up and get a little bit creative with it. Obviously, when you get into season, the specificity is king. So you will need to focus that time on running and biking and swimming and combining those strategically so that you can build on your weaknesses and magnify your strengths and feel those benefits and you feel yourself getting faster through doing specificity. But in the winter, where we are right now, important that you diversify it, especially if you have the opportunity. And I think the athletic desire to do some other things. It doesn't have to be this linear path.
Yeah, because the enjoyment factor is, so important to maintain the motivation. And we know motivation is fleeting. We've talked about that a little bit in a previous show, and it'll come up time and time again. But motivation is fleeting. Discipline is everlasting if you can develop appropriate discipline. But joy has to override, I think, all of that, because if you're not having fun, you won't continue to do it.
Absolutely.
And have that discipline. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think Ironman in particular, it's a very unique sport as a distance of race itself. People describe it to me as having a part-time job. To me, that doesn't resonate in a positive way. I would rather people identify it as a lifestyle. I think Tracy does a really good job of that. Tracy Campbell, is one of our associate coaches, and Tracy is currently dealing with a set of sort of an injury, but it's really refreshing to talk to her because her mindset is very much like, this is just my lifestyle. I'm not going to change what I'm doing. If I can't race next year or I can't race in 8 to 12 months, I'm still going to go to the pool. And I'm still going to ride my bike, and I'm still going to get up in the morning with the same drive that I do when I have a race on the calendar. It might be a little bit of a different purpose, but what it gives your brain and the endorphins and the positive mindset and how it helps you carry yourself through the rest of your life and bring your best self to work, your kids' practice, your duties as a spouse, whatever those things are, I think if it makes you a better human, lean into it and make that part of your lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we have the joy, we have to be in love with the bike. And we briefly touched on that the correct size bike is a beginning step with allowing you to be comfortable on the bike. But now let's go a little bit more into comfort, because you and I both hear people come into our studio here at Peak State Fit to get a bike fit on their tri bike, training for an Ironman, and we'll often hear people say something along the lines of, "Oh, I just assume you're supposed to be uncomfortable if you're going to be on the bike for that kind of time period." Demystify that for us, because I know from my own experience on lots of different bikes through my racing career, some of them were more comfortable than others, and that was because the fit was more appropriate for my body. But also another factor, which is how I treated my body and prepared my body to be on that bike for those hours. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, a big topic for sure. I think the common complaints, a lot of times we really work hard to address through fitting, and a lot of those things come down to appropriate body balance, so body mass representation on the saddle and on the arm pads. And we'll kind of I'll get into like the contact point discussion here in a second, but I'm going to kind of talk a little more broad and then come back to some of these in a more specific sense. But, generally speaking, if, you're doing long course triathlon racing, there's not a heavy demand on pushing you towards that more aggressive, like low, long, tight head position. Everything's like as narrow as we can get into the wind, because it's not sustainable for most athletes, especially beginners who are not as familiar with the position. So I think that's a big part of it is, giving yourself some grace and being okay with having there be a little bit more of a comfort oriented position, because it's going to accommodate your progression better than it will, push the needle on your performance. If you're comfortable, you're going to perform better. And then addressing some of the areas of our lifestyles and what we call complacent adaptations that our bodies make to our everyday lives, elements of sitting at work, our lifestyle related, even taking into account like what point in life you are. If you're a new mom or a new dad, you're having these kind of asymmetrical demands of carrying a kid, or you're maybe doing a lot more walking around in this hinged position. And so I think there's a lot of discussion that we end up peeling back some of the layers of in our studio. We start talking with people about not even dipping our toe into what are the issues on the bike, more so what are some of the issues that might arise because your lifestyle is what it is. Mm-hmm. So coming to that like expectation of comfort, no, it's not acceptable to be just in general uncomfortable. There are certain discomforts that you might experience 4 or 5 hours into a bike ride because you're sitting on a bike pedaling for nonstop for 4 to 5 hours. Of course you're going to get a little bit of pressure. You might have some friction. You might have a little bit of soreness. But these things shouldn't be acute. They shouldn't be debilitating. They shouldn't hinder how you walk the next day. You should be able to function normally after. Mm-hmm. So
and you should be able to ride the bike again in the following mm-hmm. days. We have talked to people who say, well, I have this saddle sore and I can't ride because I'm so mm-hmm. bruised. Or, but I want to back up because, it would be interesting. I know you do a very comprehensive mobility screen with everyone that comes in for a bike fit, but the question of, comfort on the bike is like, are you comfortable off the bike? Are you comfortable in your body off the bike? Because so many people are in pain before we ever put them on the bike. And so, of course, that's going to magnify everything. And I think that is probably what sets you apart as a bike fitter, is that you help people discover their maybe a path to become pain-free if they follow mm-hmm. some of your suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 100%. I'm not a physical therapist, but my role as a strength and conditioning person and who've, explored areas of movement through foundation training with Eric Goodman, through a lot of what Kelly Starrett works through in his videos. And he's a very well-renowned movement specialist, Gray Cook, Stuart McGill. I think like leaning on a lot of these people who don't have a focus in cycling, that are just very much like, just learn to move better, improve mm-hmm. your body's ability to absorb and withstand forces and distribute forces more accurately. And I think that's a big piece. It's like, not that your biomechanical patterns are good or bad. It's whether or not you're able to represent movement through an accurate distribution of muscle recruitment, of postural alignment. If your spine is compromised because of a certain distal extremity malfunction or asymmetry, then, you know, addressing that from a more global and comprehensive approach, a more integrated approach, making it more applicable to your sport. I think that's the starting point for all of these. Unlocking the tools is not getting in very precise. That's very much more a PT mindset, where, you know, you go into a PT, you have an injury, you have a specific pain, and some PTs take a different approach than others, but a lot of times it's very focused around that particular ailment. In here, we talk a lot more about, okay, let's back up, let's zoom out, and let's focus on the whole system, and let's talk through what you're doing or what you're not doing. And then we can adopt new things that are maybe going to address a lot more issues than just that one thing. We're going to create more stability through this whole posterior chain, as opposed to thinking, oh, my right hamstring is bothering me. All I need to do is work on this right leg, you know, and if
stretch.
We're doing
please don't say stretch.
We're just going to stretch. So we're just going to do
stretch.
Yeah. And I think that people have a perception that doing, that mobility is often the limiting factor, and we're not that simple. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as saying like, oh yeah, no, just stretch this and all your problems will go away. A lot of times it's one side of our body might need more mobility. My side might need a little more stability and a little bit more strength and a little bit more integrity and quality of movement. And so I think that just letting everything, like, it doesn't need to be overly complex, but just doing things that make your body, that are appropriate for your body, but make your body feel good day to day. They need to be a cornerstone. They're not something that you do when your body's already in pain, because that's too late. So I think making people aware that it's less about injury management and more about preventative maintenance. And as we get older, the grace period and the line between being 100% and in pain and unable to do our sport is a lot thinner than when we were in our 20s or in our 30s.
Right.
And come in and they're in their 40s and it's like they had that one thing that broke the camel's back that was so benign. They were maybe picking up a stick in their yard and they blew their back out. And so there's a lot of discussions that can happen before you get to that point, that is really a privilege to get to work with people on, because I'd like to believe that what we do here it's not just one focused area. It pulls in perspectives and approaches that are proven to work. It's just appropriating them to the right individual and what those individuals are dealing with. Some people are hypermobile, some people are accessible.
It's definitely a global approach. And that's one of the reason I asked this question of you today. And also I cover this a little bit in the course, Nail Your First IRONMAN, is that comfort and injury prevention is a global approach. You don't wait until you feel the pain or you feel the niggle. It's a proactive approach, you know, as part of your training. And so doing triathlon, or really any sport, is not about your sport itself in isolation, swim, bike, and run, but there's also a lot of supplementary work that doesn't take a lot of time, but the payoff is great. And whether that's doing, you know, some band work with strengthening your shoulders for swimming or being in that aero position, or as you mentioned, foundation training, that it's so beneficial. I want to move on so that we have enough time for everything that we wanted to cover. And I wanted to move into discussing training on an indoor trainer, because as Ironman is an annual calendar, there's really, you know, a lot of our athletes do race internationally, or may have a spring race in St. George, Utah, or Oceanside. So people are on the trainer, and we know that. Give us some helpful tips to cover to like become more physically adapted for our time off the outside when we're ready, and then also covering a little bit of which the handling skills topic of that you're not developing proper handling skills if you aren't your trainer. So we want to prep those people.
Yeah. The probably number one area that I think people underestimate in terms of comfort and their ability to maneuver about the bike, as well as encounter obstacles or encounter changes in direction, is their shoulder mobility and their shoulder function. I guess it's probably more function oriented than it is mobility, because there's a lot of people who have plenty of shoulder mobility and range of motion, but don't have the sort of identification of how their upper body is supposed to support and create the sort of cross-body connections in order to maneuver the bike effectively. And I'll come back to that. But the indoor aspect, when we are in our basements or our, on our trainers, wherever that might be, a lot of athletes end up either being really complacent in sort of this like really stiff, pressed up position because they're looking at a screen. And that's a really challenging thing to address, because it kind of creates a familiarity to riding the bike. You may be in a very stable position, but it's not going to absorb elements in the road very well. It's not going to be a very maneuverable position. So I think working on maybe where your screen is a good starting point of when you're racing and you're out on the road, even training, you don't need to see what's a half mile up the road. So riding with your head in this extended position, your cervical spine in this like extended craned up position is not going to be a very sustainable thing for long. It's also going to be extremely inefficient. Obviously, there's a ton of drag, but then if you're accustomed to a lower head position and you just work on gazing over your hands, creating a line of sight that is maybe 20 meters in front of you as opposed to 2 miles in front of you, you're going to maintain a much more consistent head position, a more consistent spinal angle. And then you're going to be able to not protract your shoulders, but retract your shoulders, and improve your comfort while you're in that position. Now, a lot of times athletes have to work on this specifically because, again, complacent adaptations place a lot of gravity places a lot of demands on our shoulders, and we end up in this rounded, internally rotated position, a lot of shortening to our pec minor, a lot of compensation through our chest, and then we get a lot of length through the back body, but it's not exactly length for stability. It's length because it's basically being pulled into that internally rotated position of our shoulders. So the more we can work on postural alignment with the shoulders, drawing the shoulders away from our ears, strengthening our serratus posterior superior, strengthen our subscapularis, and basically improve just how the shoulders function. And I even give a lot of isometric work to people that come into the studio and they don't understand how I'm going to demonstrate how I can go from here to here. So just notice that difference. A lot of athletes that get onto that tri-bike are here and they're really tense and they're trying to create this comfortable position, but they're like, oh man, my neck gets so tired, my shoulders. They just allow their shoulders to retract.
Yeah.
This is not a passive
we see
movement,
that.
but it's also a really, really comfortable position, and you can allow yourself to relax there. Now, that's also going to allow you to turn and counter steer and move the bike, because you're not steering like this. You're steering with leaning, you're changing your body mass. So you're changing kind of how this shoulder and this hip is connected, or this elbow and this hip, I guess. Is so, you know, it's basically
it does appear a lot of times when you see people who are holding aero position outdoors ineffectively, like you just described, it's almost like they're pushing themselves away from the bike when they're pushed up like that. And, you know, it causes so much unnecessary strain in the shoulders and lats.
It does come back to the saddle too. And if, you know, if someone's saddle is uncomfortable in that front end and they're having a hard time rotating their pelvis forward into this anterior rotation, I see a lot of kyphosis at maybe the T-spine, maybe a little bit at the lumbar spine, but essentially they're trying to escape the pressure of the saddle. And so
right.
A lot of times what we end up doing is sort of bringing the saddle down. If people are characteristically too high on their saddle height, bringing that saddle down and allowing a little bit more tilt so that they can rotate effectively into that seat. Now, that's not 100% of people. Everybody needs something a little bit different, but across the board, more often than not, people need some facilitation so they can straighten their back out and allow that space where the front end becomes more of a relaxed position, as opposed to this thing that I just like, oh, I just need to like hold myself in this position. Like you shouldn't have to hold yourself anywhere. You should just be able to be in the bike, almost like you're just being cradled by this wedge that is specifically designed for you and your length of your torso and the length of your legs and the length of your arms and the tilt of the angle of the front end, so that you can be balanced and you can feel like you're one with the bike, as opposed to being perched on top of this thing that you need to like hold a static plank for 6 hours. So yeah.
I you know, we know, well, everyone's well aware of how expensive bikes are these days. And, you know, if someone's going to spend, you know, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 on a super bike, it is so important that they take into consideration all the things that you discussed today, with that global approach of being comfortable from starting with the right size, doing injury prevention, discovering what your own maybe limitations are with your own body, because we do see people, especially in my role as an Ironman race official. I'm out on the course on a motorcycle, and I see, I monitor the bike portion of Ironman, and I see so many people out there on these beautiful bikes not holding an aero position. And I don't mean just for a moment when they're, you know, getting something out of their rear hydration. I mean long periods of time up in those bullhorns tents. I know that this is sort of such a continuation of some of the things we've already been discussing, but I'd love for you to specifically hit on what happens in our physiology when we are riding a bike in the position that's really not intended to be. So, as I just described.
So, yeah, I think if your position is not accommodating to your ability to rotate your hips and your maybe your length to the bars or the height of that front end, a lot of times it ends up becoming a very closed off hip position, and making it really challenging to feel productive. And so, you know, we're talking through people that maybe are a little overweight, and getting into that aero position just causes their knees to flare out to the side. And so when they're riding in the trainer, it's probably not as big of a deal, but like when they get out onto the road and they're on the race course and they're trying to optimize how much power they're putting out, they're a lot more consistent with their power output and their knee tracking when they're sitting upright. And they probably do their intervals like that, actually, you know, and we say that in our trainings, you know, if you're you're doing really hard intervals, do what you need to do to perform those intervals. It's not about maintaining the aero position for a VO2 max interval. Sometimes
Right.
It's just not realistic. But if that position is unattainable to maintain even an aerobic effort when you're outside, it can be highly ineffective, and people will limit the ability to breathe. So, when we're talking physiologically, what's happening to our bodies, our heart rate goes up, our power output will go down. We will, go tremendously slower if we're sitting upright on a position that was designed, on a bike that was designed to be in an aero position. And then you're recruiting muscles that you're trying to save a little bit more for the run. And so that's probably the biggest macro thing that happens, is that, you just get off the bike totally depleted, because you're doing a lot more physical work to achieve that bike split than you could if you were maybe either on a better setup for your fit. Maybe you just needed to raise the front end up, open some space, shorten your crank arm length, give yourself a little bit more room, or let your ego aside and get yourself on an endurance road bike. Use that to your advantage to be a more comfortable riding experience. Is going to allow you to more accurately represent those movement patterns, and then use that as a tool to move forward and come back to a tri bike when it's more appropriate for your body.
I believe that 100%, because a lot of people who are entering training for their first Ironman are in that journey because they are overcoming something. For some people, it's weight loss. For some people, it's a range of issues, we know. But I would say a lot of people in that first Ironman experience are not already even to the intermediate athlete ability, certainly not the elite athlete. And so the superbike might not be appropriate for them. And I know that when budget is not an option and you have the dollars to spend on whatever you want, that beautiful, shiny P5 or whatever might be just so desirable. But what is right for you? And please discover that for yourself, because it's we see more and more athletes, even older athletes, I think, coming into Ironman as a hobby. And a lot of the super bikes are not especially designed for somebody who might have an inflexible spine or, might be a mature athlete.
Yeah. And I mean, the fit windows have improved so much that a lot of times we can get a lot of things to work, but it sort of begs the question, to what end? Is this really going to push the needle on your abilities, or are you better off on a so we talked about P5 as a Cervelo, and they have an aero road bike option that's fantastic. They actually have two. One's called the Soloist and one's called the S5. And so there's those two options. Obviously, they're going to be very different across the board, and part of that's figuring out what's best for you and your spinal mobility and your pelvic range of motion and your goals and your desires of what you want to do with that bike. But I think it is important that you honestly approach, your goals and your abilities, so that you can just set yourself up for success. Because it's ultimately, I know we say this a lot in triathlon, but it's like, it's not about anybody else. It's all about you. Sometimes we get really caught up in comparing what someone else is riding or what somebody else's run split is, or, what people do in the pool. And you have to let that go. And especially as a beginner, it's just all about getting yourself prepared best for your day and your execution of that race, as opposed to it being about anything else. So, as much as you can, try to let that, it's okay to look and see what other people are doing, but take it with a grain of salt. Make it more make your experience more about yourself and about your own personal journey.
Yeah, it's so individual. Well, I truly appreciate your time today and coming back on the show to talk about cycling and the bike. We will see you again for sure. If you are listening and you're looking for more resources on doing your first Ironman, please check out Nail Your First IRONMAN, which is the course I created on doing your first Ironman. And it is linked here on all platforms that you'd be watching or listening, linked into the show notes. So thank you again, Pat. Thank you to our listeners. Hit subscribe and follow, and we'll see you for our next show where we discuss the third pillar of Ironman Triathlon, which is running. So thank you so much.
Yep. Happy training.